Tonight, I want you to stand at the mouth of a roaring blast furnace, feel the heat that warps the air, taste the grit of iron dust on your tongue, hear the hammer strikes that forged the backbone of a nation. Then step back, away from the molten steel, and picture a boy, barefoot, hungry, his small hands threading bobbins in a dark Scottish weaving shop, while his father dreams of revolution and his mother dreams of bread. His name was Andrew Carnegie, the penniless immigrant who became America's steel king, a man who turned rails into rivers of fortune, libraries into temples of learning, and wealth into a sermon he called the Gospel of Wealth. He was a ruthless titan and an idealistic dreamer, a man who squeezed pennies from steelworkers' sweat, yet spent millions to educate strangers he'd never meet. Some remember him as a robber baron. Some remember him as the saint of the public library. Tonight, we stand at the molten heart of it all, to meet the boy who built an empire and asked the world to tear it down and build something better. This is Faces of History. I'm the Duke of New York. And tonight, we roll steel and spin gold with Andrew Carnegie. Dunfermline, ancient royal burgh of Scotland, once a seat of kings, now a grey town caught between the old world and the new steam that threatened to drown it. It was here, in a low stone cottage barely warmed by a peat fire, that Andrew Carnegie first drew breath on November 25th, 1835. The Carnegies were weavers by trade, respectable enough in a place where status and faith ran deeper than coin. But respectable didn't mean comfortable. His father, William Carnegie, was a dreamer of the old craft, a weaver who spun fine linen on a handloom passed down through generations, a man who quoted Robert Burns in his sleep and argued politics in the Weaver's Tavern by candlelight. William clung to old ways, the dignity of skill, the quiet revolution of a hand that knew its work. But the world outside Dunfermline's low stone walls was changing faster than William could weave. By the time Andrew was born, the Industrial Revolution had turned spinning and weaving from cottage labor to factory trade. New steam-powered looms churned out cloth faster than any weaver's nimble fingers. Mills swallowed entire towns, spitting out cloth by the mile, and weavers by the thousands, jobless and proud. William fought back the only way he knew how, by gathering with other weavers, signing petitions, marching to protect wages. But no protest could stop iron gears and steam whistles. Margaret Morrison Carnegie, Andrew's mother, saw it more clearly. Where William dreamed of better days for hand weaving, Margaret dreamed only of survival. She was the backbone when the loom fell silent, mending shoes, taking in sewing, baking bread to sell door to door. If William was the fire of ideas, Margaret was the iron pot on the hearth, feeding her boys when no work came through the door. Young Andrew watched it all. The father's restless mind, the mother's calloused hands, the loom that became a coffin for old hopes. They were poor, but their small home was rich with words. William filled the dim cottage with stories of poetry and politics, Thomas Paine, Robert Burns, tales of brave common men who dared to speak truth to power. Little Andrew sat wide-eyed by the hearth, absorbing it all, the belief that words could lift a man higher than the handloom's wooden frame. Yet stories alone didn't fill hungry bellies. By the time he was 5, Andrew knew what it was to be hungry. He knew what it meant to see your father's eyes dim with shame when the loom stayed still and the rent came due. He also learned what a mother's iron will could do. Margaret became the family's savior, scraping pennies together, mending more boots than one woman should, her hands cracked raw by soap and cold water. She made her son promise he'd never grow soft. "Work hard, learn more, lift your head above the next man," she'd whisper when she tucked him in on straw bedding. "You're no pauper if you use your mind." Despite the poverty, Andrew's boyhood carried flashes of light. He'd slip away to the fields when he could, barefoot, shirt buttoned wrong, cheeks flushed with the freedom only a poor child knows, playing beside the ruins of Dunfermline Abbey, stones that once crowned Scottish kings. Sometimes he'd stand on those broken stones, arms wide, looking out over the fields and rooftops, as if to say, "I will not stay small." His only schooling was local and brief. He learned to read and write in a one-room schoolhouse, shoulder to shoulder with boys who'd never read Shakespeare but could recite the Psalms by heart. Andrew devoured every book he could find: poetry, history, tales of explorers and inventors. A mind that hungry finds no locked door for long. Still, the loom grew quieter. The cupboards grew barer. The dream of surviving in Dunfermline shrank to a simple truth: the Carnegies had to leave, or they would starve. In 1848, Margaret made the choice her husband could not. She sold their few belongings, furniture, William's beloved loom, the small bits of pride they still owned. She borrowed money from an uncle in America and bought 3 steerage tickets for a ship bound for Allegheny, Pennsylvania. A new world waited, but it would not wait kindly. The boy who once balanced barefoot on the stones of a ruined abbey now balanced hope against the Atlantic winds, staring out over the gray ocean toward a land where the streets were rumored to be paved with gold, but were more likely lined with sweat and smoke. Andrew Carnegie, the wee lad from Dunfermline, would step off that ship a poor boy with a strong back and a mind hungry enough to swallow the new world whole. The North Atlantic in spring is a cruel teacher. Steel gray waves, winds that slice through coats like knives, salt spray stinging raw skin. For 6 weeks in 1848, the Carnegies endured it all, packed into steerage with hundreds of other dreamers, huddled among crates, barrels, and the sharp reek of livestock. For young Andrew, not yet 13, the journey was an awakening of hardship, yes, but also of the size of the world. He lay awake at night, wedged between his mother and father on a narrow plank, listening to the pitch and roll of the sea, wondering what lay at the other end. He had only ever known Dunfermline's stony lanes and green fields. When the ship docked in New York Harbor, the Carnegies stepped ashore with less than £5 in their pockets and the names of distant relatives scribbled on a scrap of paper. They were not alone. Thousands poured in alongside them every week. The Irish, the Germans, the Scots, all drawn to America's factories, railways, and rumors of gold hidden in smokestacks and coal seams. But New York was too big, too crowded, too expensive for a weaver's ruined trade. So they boarded a rattling train, itself a marvel to the boy who'd never seen iron rails stretch for miles, and rode west to Pittsburgh's grimy shadow, to the borough of Allegheny. Allegheny in 1848 was a raw edge of America's promise. Muddy streets, low brick houses, mills belching coal smoke over the riverbanks, and jobs that paid just enough to keep a man too tired to complain. They settled into a cramped one-room tenement. Andrew shared a straw mattress with his brother Tom, the air thick with soot and the smell of factory grease drifting in through cracked windows. William tried to pick up where he'd left off. He found a loom, set it up in the corner of their small room, and began weaving linens again. But America was no kinder to an old weaver than Scotland had been. His skill, once his pride, now weighed him down. There was no place for hand-woven cloth in a city that devoured machine-made bolts by the ton. Margaret, relentless as ever, refused to drown in her husband's despair. She got to work immediately, baking bread, repairing shoes, doing laundry for wealthier neighbors, and she pushed young Andrew out the door the moment a rumor of work drifted through their block. At 13, Andrew's first American job was in a cotton mill, just like the world they thought they'd left behind. 12 hours a day, dawn to dusk, he changed bobbins for $1.20 a week. The noise was deafening, the air choked with lint that coated his throat and settled in his lungs. But every night he dropped that pay packet into his mother's tired hands, and every night she told him the same thing: "We'll make it." It was miserable, but it was work, and for a boy who'd crossed an ocean, any work was better than none. A year later, Andrew landed something better, a job as a messenger boy for the Ohio Telegraph Company. This was different. No spinning jennies, no deafening looms, just streets to memorize and names to learn. He crisscrossed Pittsburgh on foot, dodging horses and wagons, darting into banks, factories, and grand houses to deliver urgent scraps of news. He watched everything: the way men spoke, the deals they struck in back rooms, the handshake that meant more than a contract. He taught himself the Morse code clicks just by listening over shoulders. By 15, he could tap out messages faster than most grown men. More importantly, he learned names, the lifeblood of power in Pittsburgh: railroad men, factory owners, telegraph bosses. He'd tip his cap to a manager on the street and remember not just his name but his habits, his needs. People liked Andrew. the wee lad from Scotland who was always polite, always quick, always hungry to learn more. One name would change everything. Thomas A. Scott, a rising star at the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott liked the boy's speed, his wit, his hunger. He gave Andrew a new job, telegraph operator and personal assistant. Just like that, Andrew Carnegie stepped out of the muddy street and into a small wooden office that controlled the iron veins of America's expanding railroads. He was 17. He could read Morse by ear. He worked faster than men twice his age. When Scott needed a message carried by hand, Andrew ran it himself, day or night, rain or snow. For the first time, Andrew wasn't just a poor immigrant boy with lint in his lungs. He was an apprentice in an empire of steam and steel. He saw how fortunes moved through wires and rails. He took notes. He asked questions. He stayed late. He had crossed the ocean once. Now he would cross it again, in reverse, by building something so big that no wave could ever drown him again. At 17, Andrew Carnegie didn't just watch that future rumble by. He rode it, wire by wire, spike by spike. His mentor, Thomas Scott, was now a big man at the Pennsylvania Railroad, the kingmaker of America's iron arteries. And young Andrew, he was the boy wonder perched at his side, scribbling notes, translating telegraphs, running errands, learning the heartbeat of the iron horse. The Pennsylvania Railroad was no small town line. It was the largest corporation in the world at the time, an empire of iron rails that stretched farther every year, knitting cities together, swallowing towns, spitting out new industries in its wake. Andrew learned fast, faster than any boy from Dunfermline was supposed to. He knew the lines better than the men who built them. How to keep a train moving when a bridge washed out, how to reroute freight when snow choked the Alleghenies. And more than anything, how to fix a crisis before the big men in top hats even smelled smoke. When the Civil War cracked the nation's back, the railroad didn't pause. It roared louder than ever. The Union needed iron. Iron to move troops, iron to feed cannon foundries, iron to haul wounded boys back from the front. And telegraph lines, the new nervous system of war, had to hum day and night. The low thunder of cannons in the distance, a telegraph tapper hammering out urgent clicks. The Duke of New York, Carnegie, barely in his 20s, found himself with more power than men twice his age. Scott made him the Pennsylvania's eyes and ears during the war. Andrew didn't fight with a musket. He fought with wire and steam. He oversaw the building of railroad bridges faster than Confederate saboteurs could blow them down. He directed supply lines under gunfire. He worked around the clock, sleeping on piles of telegraph wire in makeshift camps. One night, when Confederate forces threatened a vital bridge in Maryland, Carnegie ordered his men to rip iron rails from sidings miles away, cart them by mule through enemy territory, and rebuild the bridge overnight. The trains rolled through before dawn. Without that steel lifeline, the Union Army might have been stranded and slaughtered. He didn't just learn to keep the iron horse moving. He learned how to ride it to wealth. Scott showed him how to invest, tiny sums at first, in the companies that fed the railroads. Sleeping cars, oil, bridges, iron foundries. Andrew plowed every borrowed dollar into these ventures. Where other men drank their wages dry on payday, he turned his into more rails, more steam, more steel. When the war ended, America's appetite for iron didn't slow down. It doubled. Railroads needed steel rails to cross rivers and mountains. Cities rising from the ashes of war needed beams, bridges, and factories. Carnegie knew where the real power lay, not just in hauling iron, but in making it. While other men rode the rails, he would forge them. In his mid-20s, Carnegie poured his savings into his first ironworks, Keystone Bridge Company. He saw that the old wooden bridges cracked under the weight of heavier locomotives. Iron, and soon steel, was the future. Stronger, cheaper in the long run. A single steel bridge outlasted a dozen wooden ones. He championed the new Bessemer process, a revolutionary way to blast impurities out of molten iron and transform it into steel quickly, cheaply, in vast rivers of liquid fire. Carnegie wasn't the only one to spot it, but he was the one who scaled it, financed it, bullied it into Pittsburgh's skyline. He cut costs ruthlessly, bought out partners when they flinched, squeezed suppliers until they squealed. His workers toiled 12-hour shifts 6 days a week for pennies, while Carnegie built factories so massive they seemed to breathe smoke and flame like dragons. By 30, Andrew Carnegie was no longer the bobbin boy from Dunfermline. He was a master of the iron horse. Rails that tied east to west, steel that gave birth to bridges and skyscrapers, telegraph lines that sang with news of the next $1 million deal. But in the back of his mind, he still heard his mother's voice. Don't stay small, Andrew. Don't be broken like your father. Make the world bigger or be swallowed by it. He didn't plan to be swallowed by anything. Not by rivals, not by labor, not by old ideas of what a poor immigrant could be. The iron horse roared on, and at its helm, Andrew Carnegie fed the furnace, laid the rails, and stoked a fortune so vast it would one day ask him, "When is enough enough?" The boy had crossed the ocean, found the rails, and now he'd cross another line entirely. From iron to steel, from manager to kingmaker, from factory floor to an empire that would shape a century. By the 1870s, the rivers ran thick with barges hauling ore, coke ovens glowed orange in the hills, and the air smelled like progress, sulfur, smoke, sweat. In this raw crucible, Andrew Carnegie would forge more than iron. He would forge steel. And in steel, he saw something no one else yet dared to grasp, that the future wouldn't be built beam by beam, but in titanic rivers of molten metal flowing faster, cheaper, stronger than anything the world had seen. The Bessemer process, a British invention that turned pig iron into steel by blasting air through it. Simple in theory, fiendishly hard in practice, but Carnegie smelled opportunity in the roar of that converter. Steel rails could carry twice the weight, twice the speed, twice the dream. So Carnegie, the messenger boy turned railroad insider, gambled big. He borrowed, he charmed investors, he squeezed every contact he'd made, racing across the telegraph wires and the rail lines. In 1875, he opened the Edgar Thomson Steel Works outside Pittsburgh, named for a railroad titan he needed to keep as an ally. Inside its gates, fire and wind fused iron into gleaming steel rails that would bind the American continent together. It was raw, brutal work. The blast furnaces burned day and night. Men sweated and bled for pennies an hour. But the output, rivers of shining steel rails, made Carnegie rich enough to drown the old weaver's poverty forever. Carnegie was ruthless, but he wasn't reckless. Every dollar he squeezed out of his workers or investors, he put right back into new plants, new machinery, new methods to make steel cheaper, faster, better. He believed that to control steel, he had to control everything that fed it. The mines that dug the iron ore, the coke ovens that turned coal into fuel, the rail lines that hauled raw stone in and shining rails out. He bought out rivals, undercut competitors. If a supplier balked, he'd build his own mine. If railroads raised rates, he threatened to lay his own tracks. He reinvested every profit instead of hoarding it, the very opposite of old money aristocrats who lived off dividends and never got their boots dirty. But empire never comes without blood on the floor. To keep prices low and profits high, Carnegie's managers pushed men to the edge. In his absence, for Carnegie liked to winter in warm villas and summer in Scottish castles, his lieutenants ruled with iron fists. Chief among them, Henry Clay Frick, a man who matched Carnegie's hunger for efficiency with a taste for breaking unions like dry sticks. At Homestead, one of Carnegie's crown jewel steel plants, Frick and the steelworkers clashed in 1892. The workers, exhausted by 12-hour shifts and relentless wage cuts, struck back. Frick built a wall around the mill, hired Pinkerton detectives armed with rifles, and turned the mill into a fortress. The two sides met on the banks of the Monongahela River. Bullets flew. Blood stained the water. The strike broke. So did any illusion that Carnegie's empire was built purely on noble ideals. Carnegie, safe in Scotland during the bloodshed, later wrung his hands in private letters, but the steel rails kept rolling out and the profits kept pouring in. By the dawn of the new century, Carnegie's mills made more steel than the entire British Empire. Pittsburgh wasn't just the Iron City anymore. It was the steel capital of the world. Carnegie steel rails carried trains across plains and prairies, across rivers and mountain ranges. His beams propped up bridges, factories, skyscrapers that clawed at clouds. America, the land of wooden cabins and muddy roads, became the land of steel and glass and ambition, taller than any forest. Carnegie's wealth was staggering, by today's measure, tens of billions of dollars. Yet the gospel he preached was not just steel, but giving it all away. The man who dies rich dies disgraced, he wrote in his famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth. Industry, he believed, should lift men up, not grind them into dust forever. It was an uneasy balance, the ruthless steelmaster who built libraries for the poor, the strikebreaker who believed education could free a man more than any union. To his critics, he was a robber baron in a velvet coat. To his admirers, he was the boy who proved that in America, a hungry mind could conquer anything, even iron itself. By the early 1900s, Carnegie's empire of steel had grown so vast that it needed a new master, or perhaps a new king to wear the Iron Crown. Enter J.P. Morgan, the banker who stitched industries together like a tailor hemming a suit. Morgan offered Carnegie an unimaginable sum to buy him out, over $400 million in 1901 money. Carnegie, who'd once hoarded pennies from bobbins, now held more wealth than many nations. When the deal was done, Carnegie Steel became the core of United States Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. The iron horse that once carried young Andrew's dreams now thundered forward without him, forging America's skyscrapers, railways, battleships. The empire was his, the steel was his, the fortune was his, but the boy from Dunfermline, barefoot in the weaving shop, bobbin boy in a Pittsburgh mill, had one last empire to build, not in iron, not in rails, but in words, books, knowledge, a legacy of libraries and education that would outlast steel beams rusting under rain. By the dawn of the 20th century, Andrew Carnegie could have been anything he wished. A railroad czar forever, an iron-fisted mill lord, a king behind walls of gilded steel. But Carnegie, who'd once crossed the Atlantic steerage class with lint in his hair, now carried a heavier weight than any beam or rail he'd forged. The question, why? Why stack dollars higher than your heart can hold? Why build a mountain of coin if your name is buried beneath it? He knew the answer that haunted men richer than him. The answer his father never found at the loom: money alone is worthless if it doesn't lift the world with you. In 1889, Carnegie sat down and wrote the creed that would carve his name in stone, not just in steel. He called it the Gospel of Wealth, not a sermon from a pulpit, but a manifesto for a new age of millionaires. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. The words were simple. The idea was revolutionary. Carnegie argued that great fortunes were not to be hoarded like a dragon's gold or left to bickering heirs who'd squander them on velvet coats and yachts. He believed the rich had a sacred duty, a moral obligation, to give their fortunes back to the people who made them rich in the first place, but not in scraps or coins tossed to beggars on cold streets. Carnegie believed true charity, wise charity, meant lifting minds, not just feeding mouths. He wanted to break the cycle that chained his father to a hand loom and left his mother mending shoes for pennies. His weapon of choice was not steel, but books. Libraries, schools, halls where a poor man's child could sit by a warm window and read his way out of poverty. He built them by the hundreds. Small-town libraries in dusty corners of America where farmers' sons could study Greek philosophy and mechanical engineering under the same roof. Carnegie libraries rose like cathedrals to knowledge, more than 2,500 of them in America, Britain, and beyond. If you've ever checked out a book in a red brick library with his name carved above the door, you've stepped into the gospel of wealth. He didn't stop at libraries. He poured millions into schools and universities: Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where once he'd built railroads to conquer distance, now he built ideas to conquer ignorance. He funded teachers, scientists, and dreamers who'd never set foot in a steel mill, but who might one day find a better way to run one, or shut one down for something greater still. Carnegie's gospel wasn't perfect. He gave millions, but the millions came from the broken backs of men who'd never see a cent of it. Homestead's ghosts lingered. Some called him a hypocrite, the strikebreaker turned saint, the robber baron who preached kindness with blood on his boots. But Carnegie never flinched from that contradiction. He admitted it openly. He called himself a trustee of the people's wealth, a steward, not an owner. The fortune was borrowed. The duty was to return it. Carnegie used his platform to push others like him, the new industrial barons, to see their gold as a tool, not a trophy. Some ignored him, some scoffed, but some listened. In Carnegie's lifetime, the seed he planted spread to Rockefeller, to Ford, to the tycoons who'd one day bankroll universities, research labs, libraries, and art museums that outlived their factories. He liked to say he was just a messenger, a man who heard his mother's whisper in every polished marble reading room. Learn more, work harder, leave something behind that can't rust away. By the end of his life, Carnegie gave away over 90% of his fortune, the modern equivalent of billions. The boy who once couldn't afford a school book made sure no child after him would be locked out of knowledge for lack of a few pennies. That was his empire now. Not the blast furnace's roar, but the quiet turning of a page, the hush of a librarian sliding a book across the desk to a child who might one day change the world. The Gospel of Wealth asked a simple question: what good is power if it dies with you? For Carnegie, the answer was written not in iron rails, but in library shelves, museum wings, university classrooms, a blueprint for a future built not just on steel beams, but on minds sharper than any blade. The man who once stood at the mouth of a roaring blast furnace now sat by wide windows looking out on green Scottish hills. No more railroads to lay, no more smokestacks to feed. The boy who'd crossed the ocean barefoot had come full circle, back to the old stone country that once could not hold him. After he sold Carnegie Steel in 1901, the deal that crowned him with a fortune so vast that some said no monarch could match it, Andrew Carnegie didn't retreat to a quiet country house just to grow roses. He kept moving, kept planning, kept writing letters with the same fierce urgency that once moved armies of steel. But now the furnaces were gone. The iron rails led inward, into the restless mind of a man reckoning with what he'd done and what he'd left undone. In his final years, Carnegie was more prolific with ink than he'd ever been with iron. He wrote essays and open letters, thousands of them, urging the rich to follow his gospel of wealth, to break the hoarding habit and pour fortunes back into books, schools, peace treaties. He wrote kings, presidents, prime ministers. Some answered, some ignored him. He offered to fund peace talks when nations bared their teeth. He dreamed of an end to war, a League of Nations, a world parliament of sorts that might bind countries together not with iron rails, but with treaties inked on soft parchment. Yet even the might of the Steel King couldn't bind men's thirst for blood. The world was drifting toward a storm darker than anything the Civil War had shown him. In 1914, the guns of August thundered across Europe. The Great War, the war Carnegie had spent his last decades trying to prevent, broke the spine of his hope for a final peace. He wrote frantic letters, urging President Wilson to broker truce. He begged kings and ministers to step back from the abyss. But the world did not listen to old men who preached libraries when the trenches needed bodies. It broke something in him. The man who'd once bulldozed rivals, bullied competitors, fired strikes with Pinkertons, now found himself powerless in the face of barbed wire and mustard gas. His health faded with the old world he'd known. The relentless drive, the fire in his belly that turned rivers of ore into mountains of profit, flickered in drafts and letters, but his hands grew unsteady. His wife, Louise, the iron-willed partner who'd soothed his storms, sat with him through sleepless nights. His daughter Margaret, his only child, reminded him of the hopeful boy he'd once been. He split his final days between Skibo Castle in the Scottish Highlands, a sprawling estate with marble halls where he entertained princes and paupers alike, and his simple stone mansion in Lenox, Massachusetts. Visitors who came to see him in those years found him smaller, almost shrunken into his oversized chairs. His once bright eyes, so sharp they could slice a balance sheet in seconds, turned soft when he spoke of books, libraries, and children learning to read their way free of poverty. He still signed checks, still gave away what he had left, funding peace foundations, educational trusts, music halls, and endowments that would stretch into the next century. But sometimes, they say, he would stand alone at the window and stare out at the hills. The same hills his father had walked in Dunfermline, the same hills he'd left behind to find a better life, and maybe to outrun the ghosts of poverty that never really left. On August 11th, 1919, Andrew Carnegie took his final breath at his estate in Lenox. He was 83 years old. The boy from the weaving shop, the bobbin boy, the iron horse whisperer, the steel king, gone in the hush of a New England summer. He left behind a fortune. But more than that, He left behind an idea that a man could take the sweat and struggle of a million workers and turn it into cathedrals of books. That a child who cracked open a library door could walk out a king in his own right. They buried him in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery beneath a modest stone. No iron crown, no steel beam, no blast furnace roaring overhead. Just the wind in the trees and the quiet murmur of pages turning in libraries around the world. So next time you step into a small town library, smell the old pages, hear the soft creak of the librarian's cart. Think of the wee lad from Dunfermline who believed books could do what steel never could. Outlast the empire, outlive the king, outshine the rails that once bound a nation together. So next time you pass a library's stone steps, think of the barefoot boy threading bobbins in a Scottish mill. Think of the sweat and blood that fed the blast furnaces. Think of a man who forged an empire from molten steel, then tried to melt it back down into knowledge. Faces like Carnegie's remind us that wealth is never simple, that a single fortune can build castles and break backs, open doors and close them just as fast. If you learned something tonight, share this story, subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends that Faces of History doesn't just teach, it lays the rail, stacks the steel, and leaves a book open in the quiet dark. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, sometimes the richest thing you own is the story you pass on.